Imagine a traveler caught in the merciless English winter. The icy wind is chilling to the bone. The wet snow is pelting his face, and the road has become a frozen, impassable rut. And then, in the thickening dusk, he sees in the distance a dim, shivering light, the saving light of the tavern. In our imagination, it's an image of coziness, a crackling fireplace, hot food, and a mug of ale. But what if it's just an illusion? What if behind the door of this shelter lay a world in its own way, even more terrible than the winter storm outside? A world where you had to fight for a place by the fire, where the food was rotten and the air was so stale and smoky that it made you cough, where the cold came not only through the gaps in the walls, but also from the icy floor and the wet, rotting straw underfoot. Today, we're going to tear away the veil of romantic notions and show you what a medieval English tavern was really like in winter. It was not a place for fun, but a desperate attempt to survive, a trap where the external threat of cold was replaced by internal threats of disease, violence, and suffocation. Prepare to be immersed in a world where the only alternative to freezing to death in a field is to spend the night in a crowded, smelly, and dangerous room. This is an account of why warmth in the Middle Ages had its own, sometimes very terrible price. For the weary traveler who had spent hours trudging through the blizzard wall on the frozen, deserted road, the dim, shivering light of the tavern in the thickening dusk was more than a landmark. It was a beacon of hope, a promise of salvation. He promised three main things that were becoming synonymous with life: protection from the bone-chilling wind, warmth from the hearth, and perhaps a bowl of hot broth. In his imagination, this was the place where the suffering of a long day would finally end. However, after gathering his last strength and waddling to the snow-covered door, the traveler often changed from one hostile environment to another. The hope of coziness and comfort was shattered by the harsh reality as soon as he crossed the threshold. The first thing that greeted him was not a wave of heat, but a physical assault on the senses. The thick, acrid smoke from the central hearth, which hung beneath the low, smoky ceiling in a thick, oily veil, was blowing into his nose and throat, making his eyes water instantly and his lungs clench in an agonizing cough. Instead of the clean, frosty air, he was enveloped in a heavy, foul odor, laced with dozens of disgusting scents. The stench of unwashed, sweaty bodies, the sour smell of wet, stale wool, the pungent smell of musty ale, rotting straw from the dirt floor, and, of course, the ubiquitous aroma of burnt fat and burnt porridge. Instead of peace and quiet, he was deafened by drunken shouts, coarse, guttural laughter, arguments over a game of dice, and the incessant, hacking coughs of the other lodgers throughout the room. The warmth he longed for was an illusion. It was concentrated only in a small, privileged circle around the fire, and that place, of course, was already crowded with those who had come earlier or had more rights. In the rest of the hall, especially at the entrance, the same icy drafts swept through, and the stone or earthen floor had a grave chill that made his feet cold. The tavern didn't keep out the cold entirely. It merely enclosed it within four walls, adding smoke, stench, cramped quarters, and a new social menace. It was a terrible, crushing disappointment. The traveler was fleeing the pure but deadly cold of nature to enter the filthy, stuffy, but conventionally safe cold of human habitation. It was a bargain where the price for a roof over his head was high. The illusion of shelter was quickly dissipating, giving way to the bitter realization that survival here was just another form of brutal struggle. And the first battle each newcomer faced was not with the cold, but with other people. A battle for access to fire. The only source of heat in the tavern's common room was an open hearth, and this small, smoldering island of life in the midst of the icy gloom became the arena for a violent, though often silent, social struggle. The right to bask by the fire was not universal. It had to be earned, bought, or won. There was a silent but clear hierarchy of warmth in the tavern, where your place by the fire was a direct reflection of your status in this temporary, harsh community. The best, warmest seats right by the fire on massive benches belonged to the first class of guests. These were either the richest and most noble guests, small knights, priests, wealthy merchants, or the strongest and most insolent, a squad of hired soldiers, a local bully and his friends. They could either pay the innkeeper for the privilege or simply chase away the weaker ones. They sat with their legs drawn up to the fire, talking loudly, laughing, and looking down on the others shivering in the semi-darkness. Their backs and faces glistened with heat and grease, while the others could barely warm their numb fingers. The next wider circle was occupied by second-class guests, small traders, itinerant artisans, wealthy peasants who came to the city on business. They could count on at least some of the heat reaching them, but they could no longer claim a place in the front row. They huddled together on the far pews, trying to catch a little of the heat reflected off the walls or the backs of the chosen ones, and listened enviously to the conversations of those more fortunate. And on the very periphery, in the icy zone by the cold, blowing walls, and by the perpetually slamming door, huddled the lowest and poorest, beggars, laborers, small pilgrims, fugitive peasants. All they got was the icy drafts, the thick smoke that accumulated away from the hearth, and a sense of their own humiliation. They could only look longingly and with a hidden anger at those who were lucky enough to be in a circle of light and warmth. For them, the tavern remained as cold as the street, only protecting them from the direct wind and snow. This battle for warmth was daily and merciless. When a newcomer entered the tavern, he had to instantly assess the situation by his clothes, manners, and the looks of the others, and understand his place. An attempt to take someone else's warmer place, if you were not entitled to it by status or power, inevitably ended in a fight. Warmth was currency, status, and power. And this cruel hierarchy clearly demonstrated that even in the common misfortune of facing winter, people were not equal. But even those who managed to win a place by the fire had to face another enemy, the taste of winter itself. The winter menu in a medieval English tavern was the epitome of despair, monotony, and culinary ingenuity born of need. While in summer one could still count on fresh vegetables, fish from the nearest river, or even a piece of meat from a visiting hunter, in winter the ration was narrowed down to a few basic canned foods, the taste and quality of which were terrible. It was food not for pleasure, but for survival, fuel for the freezing body. The main drink and source of calories was ale, but in winter it brought unpleasant surprises. Barrels of ale stored in cold, unheated cellars often partially froze. As a result, the ale became thick, syrupy, sometimes with ice crystals floating in it. The innkeeper could try to warm it by the hearth, but this often gave the drink a disgusting, sweetly burnt flavor. Often, to save on the already meager supply of malt, the ale was ungodly diluted with water, and in winter this diluted, tasteless drink was also icy cold. Drinking it was like swallowing cold, bitter, yeast-flavored water. There was usually only one hot meal, perpetual chowder, or pottage. It was a perpetual soup. The cauldron was rarely ever completely emptied and washed. New ingredients were simply added to the leftovers from yesterday's cooking and put back on the fire. In winter, this cauldron was not the same as in summer. The basis was the cheapest and longest stored food: dried peas, beans, barley, and root vegetables that had survived the winter in the cellar, shriveled, almost wooden turnips, and parsnips blackened by time. All this was boiled in the same cauldron for hours or even days, turning into a tasteless, gray, slimy mass that only remotely resembled food. Meat was a pipe dream. The only option available to the innkeeper was corned beef or pork, salted in the fall during the mass slaughter on Martin's Day. By midwinter, it became as hard as wood and so soaked in salt that it had to be soaked for several days. Even so, it remained tough, fibrous, and almost inedible, resembling salty rope in taste and texture. Often, innkeepers would buy meat from fallen or diseased animals to mask the odor of spoilage with garlic, onions, and long cooking in a common cauldron. Sometimes a lucky poacher would bring in a skinny hare or a few pigeons, which would be immediately put into the soup, thus raising the price. The total lack of fresh herbs meant that travelers who stayed in the tavern for long periods of time developed scurvy. Bread was also winter bread, stale, made of coarse flour, often with bran, pea flour, or even ground acorns for volume. Fresh baked goods were rare. The traveler had to soak this stone bread in his liquid broth to chew it. The taste of winter in the tavern was the taste of salt, mustiness, sour ale, and hopelessness. And the atmosphere in which all this was being absorbed was not just unpleasant, but truly stifling. In winter, the tavern became a sealed box, an airtight trap. In order to preserve every bit of precious warmth, the owner and guests plugged every crevice through which the icy wind could penetrate. The window openings were closed with massive wooden shutters and additionally covered from inside with old, dirty sacks, skins, or pieces of felt. The door was also sealed around the perimeter with moss and soot, and a heavy curtain was hung at the entrance. As a result, air circulation was practically stopped. In the center of the hall, an open hearth was constantly burning and smoldering, the fuel for which was often not dry wood, but anything that could be obtained: damp dead wood, smoky peat, or even dried dung. Any smoke that did not escape through the small hole in the roof remained inside, mingling with the fumes of wet clothes, unwashed bodies, spilled ale, and the breath of dozens of people. The air in the tavern was becoming thick, heavy, oily, and almost unbreathable. It wasn't just a room, but a real smokehouse for humans. The ceiling and beams were covered in a thick layer of sticky black soot that sometimes flaked down into the food and drink. It was a real smoke dungeon. His eyes were constantly watering from the acrid smoke. His throat was sore, and he began to cough painfully. Chronic bronchitis and conjunctivitis were occupational diseases of the innkeepers and their regular customers. Soot settled everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, on their faces, and in their lungs. Carbon monoxide concentrations in such an unventilated room could reach dangerous levels. Headaches, nausea, dizziness, lethargy, and apathy were common companions of visitors. In particularly cramped and poorly arranged taverns, people could get seriously poisoned without even realizing it, and simply fall asleep, never to wake up. They faced a terrible choice: to open a door or a window to let in some fresh air, but with it the icy cold that would instantly freeze the room and nullify all efforts to heat it, or to continue to sit in this warm but poisonous atmosphere. More often than not, the second was chosen. The fear of freezing was stronger than the fear of suffocation. This constant hypoxia and intoxication from the products of combustion took its toll on health. Chronic respiratory diseases were common among the tavern regulars. The winter in the tavern was accompanied by a continuous, piercing cough, and this poisoned air was saturated not only with smoke, but also with the miasmas of diseases brought by special winter guests. Winter drove the most desperate and destitute onto the roads. If in summer the vagabonds, beggars, and landless laborers could spend the night in the open air, eating what they could steal or beg when the cold came, the only chance of survival for them was the tavern, no matter how terrible it was. They flocked here from all around like moths to a smoking flame, bringing with them not only their misfortunes and lice, but also a whole bunch of dangerous diseases, which in the confined space acquired the power of a plague. In the tavern, one could meet peasants who had been driven from the land by debt or who had fled the famine caused by crop failure. They were emaciated to the point of being living skeletons, dressed in unimaginable rags, their bodies covered with sores from scurvy and skin diseases, and their eyes burning with a feverish, hungry gleam. They would give their last copper penny or work for the innkeeper all day, chopping wood, cleaning the stable, for a bowl of liquid stew and the right to sleep in the coldest corner on dirty, stale straw. Their despair and silent, deafening hatred for the more fortunate visitors were in the air, creating an oppressive atmosphere. They were joined by demobilized soldiers left destitute after another military campaign, cripples displaying their mutilations in the hope of alms, beggarly, wandering monks expelled from their orders for drunkenness or heresy, and fugitive criminals for whom the tavern was a temporary refuge from the noose of the gallows. The tavern in winter became the social bottom, the place where all the troubles, vices, and diseases of medieval society were concentrated. For an ordinary traveler with a little money or food supplies, such a neighborhood was extremely dangerous. A hungry and desperate man with nothing to lose was capable of anything, and stealing a purse or even killing for a piece of bread was commonplace here. These winter guests were walking carriers of all kinds of infections. Lice, fleas, and scabies were their constant companions, and the parasites quickly spread to the new guests in the common bedroom. But much worse were the winter diseases, what today we would call influenza, pneumonia, bronchitis, and in those days could be tuberculosis, consumption. In a crowded, unventilated, smoke-filled room, one coughing person could infect dozens of others overnight. To sit next to a person shaking with coughing and spitting blood on the floor was almost certainly to become infected. Weakened by malnutrition and the hardships of the journey, the traveler's body was an easy target for any infection. Many who entered the tavern seeking relief from the cold found themselves dying of a disease contracted from a straw bunkmate. The tavern in winter became a real incubator of contagion, a death trap, where invisible death was more real than a robber with a knife. And if the daytime was at least a distraction, then with the endless winter darkness came the most difficult and dangerous time, the time when human vices flourished in full force. Winter nights in medieval England were not just dark, they were endlessly, unbearably long. The daylight hours were short, and after sunset, around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, people had an enormous amount of time before dawn to occupy. In the cramped, stuffy, and crowded tavern, this forced idleness, fueled by cheap, murky ale, often had explosive consequences. Boredom was as much an enemy as the cold, and it drove people to the wildest acts. The main entertainment, and at the same time a way to earn or lose the last penny, was gambling. First of all, dice. Simple, made of bone or wood. They were in the pocket of almost every soldier or vagrant. A group of men would gather around a makeshift table, an overturned barrel, or simply on the trampled floor, and the game would begin. They gambled for money, for things, for food, for the next sip of ale. The stakes were small, but the excitement was enormous. The game was often accompanied by shouting, swearing, mutual insults, and of course, accusations of fraud, which were not always groundless. Disputes over dice were the most common cause of fights in taverns. Heavy fists, wooden cups, benches, and of course, the knives everyone had. In a confined space among drunk and irritated people, a drunken brawl could instantly escalate into a bloody stabbing with several victims. The innkeeper and his servants, fearing for their lives, were not always able or willing to intervene, preferring to wait until it was all over and just dump the bodies outside. In addition to dice, various board games like Nine Men's Morris, checkers, or the primitive cards that were beginning to appear. But these too were often the occasion for conflict. The long, dark night, alcohol, boredom, and general irritation caused by the cramped, smoky, and uncomfortable conditions created an incredibly tense, explosive atmosphere. The psychological pressure was immense, and any trifle, a careless word, a slanted glance, an accidentally spilled ale, could be the last straw and led to an explosion of violence. Sometimes, to break the boredom, someone would belch out a song, usually coarse, soldierly, or bawdy, full of obscenities. The others picked up on it, but even singing could end in a quarrel if someone didn't like the repertoire or the performer. Another entertainment was stories. A visiting pilgrim might tell tales of holy places, a soldier of battles, or a local villager, a frightening legend of a ghost in the neighboring swamp. These stories, told in the semi-darkness to the howling of the wind, further thickened the atmosphere of superstitious fear. In such an environment, surviving meant not only staying warm, but also having the luck and intuition to notice an emerging conflict in time to stay away from it. And this threat came not only from people, but also from the conditions of the main asset of any traveler, his horse. For many travelers, especially merchants, knights, messengers, or prosperous farmers, their horse was not just a means of transportation, but a capital asset, a working tool, and a comrade in arms. It was worth a fortune. To lose a horse in winter, far from home, was tantamount to disaster, often meaning ruin or even death from hunger and cold. And the stables of a medieval tavern were often as horrible and dangerous a place as the inn itself, presenting another harrowing ordeal for the traveler. The stables, or rather simple barns, were cold, wind-swept structures with earthen floors and leaky thatch roofs. They were rarely heated. Horses were tethered in cramped, dark stalls, often without sufficient dry straw bedding. The animals were forced to stand for hours on cold, wet, frozen ground, mixed with manure and urine, suffering from the same drafts as their owners. This environment was ideal for the development of hoof diseases, such as hoof rot and respiratory illnesses. Ammonia fumes from urine corroded the animals' eyes and lungs. The fodder offered by the innkeeper for a separate, often excessive fee was meager and of poor quality. Instead of good oats, necessary for the horse's strength, they often gave cheap barley, bran, or stale, rotten hay, which could give the horse deadly colic. Water for drinking was icy and had to be broken through a frozen barrel. In such conditions, a healthy but tired horse, after a long crossing, could easily get sick and die. But the main danger, besides disease and cold, was horse thieves. Tavern stables were a favorite place for thieves. At night, taking advantage of the darkness and general confusion, they could steal the best horse. The locks on the stalls were rudimentary, and the grooms, if there were any, were often in league with thieves or simply drunk and asleep. To lose a horse on the road meant imminent hardship or even death for the traveler. In addition, contagious diseases such as sleeping sickness spread easily in the common stable. A sick horse could infect all the others overnight. Tavern keepers rarely cared about veterinary inspection when accepting any animals for lodging. So for any responsible traveler, a night at the tavern involved constant worry for their four-legged friend. He went out into the cold stable several times a night to see if his horse was still there, if it was shivering from the cold, if it was all right. Often the traveler preferred to sleep not in the relative warmth of the common hall with the men, but right in the icy stable, on a pile of stinking straw next to his horse. The innkeeper held another vital resource in his hands, and he traded it without remorse. In the icy hell of a winter tavern, the most valuable commodity, the most desirable luxury, was not beer or food, but warmth. And the innkeeper had a complete and undivided monopoly on that commodity. He was the lord of the fire, and it depended on his will and greed whether or not his guests would freeze to death that night. This power almost always turned into shameless, cynical exploitation of desperate people. The innkeeper himself was a hostage to winter. His own supply of firewood or peat was finite, and he needed to stretch it until spring so that his own family would not freeze. Therefore, every piece of wood thrown into the fire was the result of a cold calculation. How much heat can be sold to the guest today so as not to be left without fuel tomorrow? Fuel in winter was worth its weight in gold. The innkeeper had to procure or buy firewood himself, and he was not going to waste it on heating poor travelers for free. So the fire in the hearth was seldom a cheerful, roaring blaze. More often it was a smoldering, smoky fire of the cheapest wood, raw dead wood that sizzled and spit, or peat that filled the room with an acrid, choking odor. A seat by this dubious source of heat was a paid service. If you wanted to sit in the warmth, stretching your legs to the fire, you had to pay. The price varied, and it increased as the temperature outside the window dropped. In the bitterest frosts, when there was a blizzard outside, it could be as much for the right to sit by the fire as for a mug of ale, or even for a night's lodging in a cold corner. Whoever could pay got the best seat. It was a whole theatrical production. A wealthy merchant threw a coin on the table and took a bench by the fire. A squad of soldiers, without asking, simply pushed the others. A poor man could offer his services in exchange for warmth, chopping wood for the morning, cleaning the stable, or simply telling a story to entertain those who paid. Those who had less money were relegated to the second or third circle from the fire. Those who could not pay at all were condemned to sit in the coldest, unlit, and blown-out corners of the hall, right by the door. This created even more social tension and visibly demonstrated the gulf between people. The right to warmth became a visible sign of wealth and status. If a tavern had private rooms, which was rare and very expensive, one had to pay separately for the right to light a fire in it or to get a brazier with coals, and the price was robbery. It was not only for warmth, but also for safety and privacy, for a chance to escape the chaos of the common room. The innkeeper was well aware that a freezing merchant or a noble traveler had no choice, and he took shameless advantage of it. This heat monopoly was an important item of the innkeeper's income. He was not just trading in firewood, he was trading in survival. It was cynical, but in keeping with the brutal laws of the time. Often this economic dependence led to conflicts when travelers without money tried to force their way to the fire, which ended in a fight. This ruthless economy of survival determined not only comfort, but also had a direct impact on health and the chances of surviving until morning. The morning in the winter tavern was not a relief, but perhaps the worst of the ordeal. The night was ending, but the horror did not go away, only changed its form, becoming even more palpable. The awakening was slow, heavy, and unpleasant. The fire in the hearth was either completely extinguished during the night, or there were only a handful of embers smoldering under a layer of ashes, giving little or no heat. The room was cold, and the morning temperature inside was often only a couple of degrees higher than outside. The first breath burned his lungs with the icy, stale air. The air was thick, cold, and damp from the breath of dozens of people. There was a thick layer of frost on the walls and ceiling, which at the first sign of morning warmth began to melt, dripping icy, dirty drops on the sleeping people. The water in buckets and tubs was covered with a thick crust of ice, which had to be broken with the handle of a knife. Getting up from the rotten, damp straw, which had absorbed moisture from breath, sweat, and melted snow from their clothes overnight, was torture. Their bodies were stiff, their joints ached unbearably from the cold, and the clothes they slept in were damp, cold, and clammy. They had to get ready for the road again, forcing themselves to move through the shroud of apathy and physical malaise. The first thing everyone awake did was to huddle around the hearth, watching the innkeeper or his servant grumbling as they tried to fan the fire from the last smoldering embers. This process could take a long time, and all the while people stood shivering, enveloped in their own steam. To put on the frozen leather shoes, stiff as wood, was a separate torment. They had to be kneaded and warmed by a fire that was barely burning. Breakfast, if there was money left over, consisted of a piece of stale bread, hard as stone, and a mug of ice-cold, sour ale. Hot food in the morning was only a dream, for making a fire and cooking the stew took time and expensive wood, which the master saved for the evening warmth trade. Then you had to go to the icy stable to check on your horse, hoping it hadn't gotten sick overnight and been stolen. Getting the frozen, shivering animal out, putting on the icy, stiff harness, all of this required a tremendous amount of effort. And finally, having paid off the scowling innkeeper, who was billing for all the pleasures, to go out into the cold again, in the howling wind, on the frozen, dangerous road, feeling even more tired, sick, and empty than the day before. The morning in the tavern did not offer a sense of rest and recuperation. It only emphasized that the night was only a short, painful respite in the endless struggle for survival. It was not an awakening to a new day, but to a new round of misery, and his only thought was to live to see the next tavern as horrible as this one. So we opened the heavy door of a medieval English tavern in winter and saw a world far from romantic fantasies. It was not a cozy haven, but a harsh, dangerous, and frankly horrible concentrate of all the ills of that era. Cold, hunger, disease, filth, smoke, violence, and fear. This is what really awaited the traveler behind the sign with the image of a boar's head. The tavern was not a place of rest, but a place of survival where everyone fought for himself. It was a mirror of a cruel time where human life was cheap and comfort was a pipe dream. But it was the existence of these, albeit terrible, islands of civilization that allowed people to travel, to trade, to fight. In short, to maintain life in the country. By studying this unpalatable truth, we better understand the incredible resilience and endurance our ancestors possessed. Their ability to survive in such conditions inspires not only shudder, but also respect. If you are interested in this dive into the harsh reality of medieval life, and you want to know more about how people really lived, loved, and suffered in the past, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. There are many more stories ahead of you, tearing the veil off the historical myths.